Alright, you guys, this is going to be a really short recording. I just want to cover a little bit about water. That's chapter 3 in the ninth edition. That's your guys' textbook right now. So water is obviously going to be a critical molecule throughout our entire year because it's a critical molecule throughout all living things. Now, what I've done here is I've kind of collected 4 major takeaways that you need to understand from chapter 3, because when you actually read chapter 3, as you guys did over the summer, it's pretty intense seeming, and really it all boils down to 4 big things. You have to know some of the properties of water and why those properties of water are consequences of this hydrogen bonding that I'm sure you read about. And we're going to be coming back to hydrogen bonding all the time in this class. Now, within that, when you're talking about how hydrogen bonding affects different properties of water, there are 4 specific properties of water that we really care about for this class, and so I'm going to go through those very briefly, and then those are of course going to affect why water is so essential to life on Earth as we know it. You need to be familiar with the pH scale. Now, the pH scale sounds intimidating because they talk about how it's logarithmic, but it's really not that intense, and so I'll show you how to do a basic calculation, but you really won't have to worry too much about it. And then just understanding what a buffer is and why that might be useful in a living organism. So the first property of water that we want to talk about is its polarity. So that means it has poles. It is polar. Okay. Now the reason water is polar is because the oxygen part of water, of H2O, the oxygen really likes electrons, right? So it's very electronegative, just to remind you from chemistry. And so that means that the electrons like to hang out with that oxygen. And so to just kind of show you what that looks like, so in a typical water molecule that you'll draw, like in my class for instance, you're going to draw just a really simple, almost L-shaped, okay? So we have one big oxygen atom and 2 little hydrogen atoms right here. Okay. Now remember that these bonds are covalent bonds. That's when 2 atoms share some electrons. Okay, so that's what's going on right here. The hydrogen atom and the oxygen atom are sharing some electrons. However, remember I said oxygen really likes electrons, so they like to hang out with him more. So that gives the oxygen what we call a partial, that's what this little Greek symbol means. It's a partial negative charge. Because if you have a bunch of negative things hanging out with you, you're going to be more negative, and electrons are, of course, negative. Now, over here, remember, there's some shared electrons here. If they're spending most of their time over here, that means they're not spending much of their time over here, okay, with the hydrogen. So the hydrogen, I'm going to try to draw the same sigma. I'm using my mouse. It's a little difficult. The hydrogen atoms are going to be partially positive, okay? So they're the opposite of the oxygen. Now, when I say partially, it doesn't mean that they have ionized, if you remember ionization from your guys' chapters. It just means that it's still a covalent bond. It is not an ionic bond, but they just like to hang out over here more. Okay? And so typically, at an average time, if you were just to take like a quick little screenshot of a water molecule, like this kind of it's doing right down here, this image, then most of the time the oxygen will be slightly negative, and most of the time the hydrogens will be slightly positive. And as you guys know, positives and negatives attract, right? That's an electrical thing that we talk about all the time. This positive likes to hang out with this negative. And so when they like to hang out, it's kind of like a little magnet. It's kind of hard to pull them apart, okay? And that's what this little hydrogen bond is trying to show us. This little dashed line is just saying, hey, this guy is attracted to this guy. Okay? Now, you can break hydrogen bonds fairly easily, but if you look down here, I only have 5 molecules of water in this little diagram. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Oxygen atoms are, of course, represented by the big red, and hydrogen by the white. But there's a bunch of hydrogen bonds between them. Okay, you see all of those? Right now there's 4, but if this was like a full beaker of water, there would be a way more molecules. And so this guy may be interacting with this one over here, but he could also be interacting with more over here. So maybe there's a little hydrogen bond happening right here. So I'm going to put H bond Okay, and that's attracted to the oxygen of another water molecule. Okay, because molecules are super tiny, as you guys know. So, or excuse me, atoms are super tiny and molecules, and so there's going to be a ton of them in just a simple beaker of water. So I just want you guys to get used to recognizing that and seeing these bonds. Okay. Now, each individual water molecule can form up to 4 of those hydrogen bonds. That's what's happening right down here. This center one has 4 hydrogen bonds with 4 other hydrogen molecules. Okay, so you'll typically see 2 hydrogen atoms in neighboring molecules attracted to this oxygen, and that's because there's 2 electrons that hang out more here. But you don't really need to worry too much about that. Okay. Now, a second property of water, well, part of it really, is its cohesion. So co means together or same. Okay, so like you have a co-worker, and a co-worker is somebody you work with. Okay, so cohesion should mean together or same. So hydrogen bonding between like molecules. So what does that mean when we say like molecules? Well, for the case of water, it's going to be talking about other water molecules. Okay, so when water molecules really like to hang out with each other, they like to form those hydrogen bonds, just like we saw in that last image. These are hydrogen bonds being formed between 2 or more water molecules. That's the same molecule, so we would call that cohesion. Okay? If it was a different molecule, it would be called adhesion. We'll get to that in a second. But cohesion causes some really cool stuff that you might have seen around you. It causes water's high surface tension. Okay, so a surface tension is how hard it is to kind of break the surface of a liquid. Okay, if a liquid likes to hang out with itself, it's going to be hard to kind of insert yourself into it. Okay, so here we have a little insect, a little water strider, and he is able to utilize the surface tension of the water by spreading out his legs, and he's not breaking the surface tension, and that allows him to float on top. Okay? So he's using these hydrogen bonds, and just how many there are, it's just crazy how much are going on right here. He's using those to keep himself afloat, and we'll come back to that more in class. Now, as I talked about adhesion, so think about an adversary. It's someone who's different from you. So ad is going to refer to differences. And so adhesion is going to be bonding between unlike molecules. So if cohesion was a hydrogen bond that was between, if cohesion was between water and another water, okay, so I'm going to do a little hydrogen bond. I have my oxygen, I have my hydrogen. Okay, so this is cohesion that I'm drawing up here. Adhesion would be the same idea. Okay, it's still hydrogen bonding. So still have a water molecule for the case of this class, that's what we're going to talk about. Except instead of it being another water molecule, it's something else, okay? We'll talk about specific examples, so I don't want to get too much into that right now, but it's just not another water molecule, okay? And so we see a lot of this out in nature all the time. Plants show a lot of really cool examples. So here we have some water that is adhesive, I should say, to this plant here, okay? So this plant, the part that it's touching is not water, okay? It's like probably its waxy cuticle. Okay, and so it's hanging out on there. Really, really, really likes it there. Okay, and it's even fighting against gravity. So when you see dew on grass, often you can see that it's fighting gravity because it should be falling and it's not. Okay, so the adhesive force is just how water likes to hang out with other things. Okay, and that's also because of its polarity. Its polarity is pretty much the reason for all of the cool stuff we're going to talk about in water. Now, transpiration is kind of an aside in your textbook. Your book talks about it a little bit, and I don't want to go too much into it because we hopefully will have time to do a lab on it. But transpiration is literally just water moving up a plant, and that might sound really simple, but it requires some of the stuff that we've already talked about. So we talked about how water likes to hang out with itself, and so the water will grab itself and kind of form a long chain, because we need to get water from the roots way down here all the way up to the tippy top of the tree. How do we do that? Well, water likes to hang out with itself, And water likes to cling to other things, okay? So there's these xylem tubes inside of the trunks of trees, okay? And that's basically the highway for the water. So the xylem, excuse me, is just a long tube that goes all the way up the tree, okay? And it branches off and all that, but don't worry about that. So it goes all the way up the tree, and if it's a long tube, well, it's not made of water, right? It's made of wood. Okay. So if water clings to that wood, that would be considered adhesion because it's not clinging to water at that point, but it might start to move up, right? Because water likes to cling to itself. You guys have seen capillary action before. Okay. It's going to move up a little bit, and then as the first water molecule moves up, he's attracted to some of his friends. His friends over here are going to get dragged up as well. And so they're going to get all the way up the tree. And so I don't really want to delve too much into this because it is more complicated than that, and it is super interesting. And we'll continue to look at it as a case study, but I just wanted to provide an example of how water and its properties can be at work in an organism. So water also, of course, is used in biological organisms for moderation of temperature. Okay, so in order to talk about temperature, we kind of have to define some different parts of temperature. So we have heat. Heat is the total amount of kinetic energy in a given system. So kinetic energy is the energy of movement. And you guys know that anything is made up of particles, right? Well, anything for this class is made up of particles. And so those particles are in motion. And so that motion represents this kinetic energy. Okay. Now, your temperature is the measured intensity of the heat due to the average kinetic energy of molecules. So that sounds really complicated. But just think about, if you will, let me get a pen going here. Just think about a simple glass of water. Okay? I don't know why my glass is shaped like that. It's because I'm using this mouse. Okay? So I have a simple glass of water. It's shaped like a boot, but who cares? It's got a bunch of particles. So many particles. We can't even imagine how many particles. Okay, so I'm just trying to add a bunch of little dots, and my computer's kind of lagging a little bit, so they're coming out as lines, but whatever, it's fine. Okay, each of those particles is moving in some direction. Okay, and when you're moving, you have kinetic energy, right? And if you were to average this kinetic energy from all of these molecules in this water, you would actually get your temperature of the water. Okay, so that's what thermometers are basically measuring. They're measuring how much and how often things are hitting them and with what force. Okay. So with that, you have to start thinking about how we measure temperature and how that temperature is distributed. Okay, I'm kind of going to skip over this question because I kind of want to come to it in class, but water has this amazing thing. It's called its high specific heat. Okay, so specific heat is just a thing that can be used to describe any substance. So you have a specific heat. Different parts of your body have a different specific heat, right? And specific heat is basically just how much heat or how much energy it takes to raise your temperature. Okay, so when you have a high specific heat, that means that it's kind of hard to change your temperature. Okay, so water has a high specific heat, so that means that it takes a lot of energy to bring water up. Okay, so for instance, if you're out on a beach and it's really, really hot, maybe it's 2 p.m. and it's really, really hot, the sun has just been blazing, and the sand is way too hot to be standing on for very long. Well, you can go out to the ocean and you'll probably notice that the ocean feels pretty nice. It's pretty cool. The sun has been on the ocean, that part of the ocean, for about the same amount of time, but because of water's high specific heat capacity, it hasn't warmed up as much. Okay, so the same amount of energy has hit the sand and the water, basically, right, per unit area, but the water hasn't moved up in temperature as much, and that's because it takes way more energy to do that than something like sand. Okay, now, also, you have larger bodies of water, like the ocean itself, able to store more and more energy because it's just so vast. All of those particles are going to interact. Okay? And this works the other way too. So it is harder to heat up, but it's also harder to cool down. So maybe in the evening time, if you have ever been on a beach at night, you may be on the sand and realize that the sand is freezing. right? If it's a windy day, especially, the sand is really cold. But you can go out to the ocean, and often, if it's the right time of night, you'll find that the ocean is still quite warm. So it took in all of that heat from the sun, and it still feels excellent, right? It's still nice and warm because it's holding on to that heat. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about this because this kind of plays a critical role in most biological systems. But just to kind of give you an idea, humans are about 65% water, right? And because we have so much water, that allows us to stabilize our temperature, which means that we're resisting a change in temperature. Now, obviously, you can get warmer, you can get cooler. And we're going to talk about some of those systems and why you might want to become warmer or cooler, or why you might want to avoid becoming warmer or cooler. But water kind of helps keep us in that happy little zone. Now, water does another thing. It's called evaporative cooling. You've probably heard of it. But I don't want to get too much into it. But basically, water has a high heat of vaporization. Okay? So if you think about a glass of water again, okay, let me get my pen. So if you think about a glass of water, I'm going to try not to make this one boot-shaped, much smaller. Okay, here's a glass of water. All right. Now, some of those particles that we talked about before, just got to drag it just a little bit. They're all moving, right? All these particles are moving in some way. Okay, different directions, different speeds, all that stuff. Now, the ones that are most likely to leave and become a different state, a gaseous state, okay, so gas, are going to be the ones with the highest kinetic energy, so the ones that are moving the fastest. Okay. Now, because we have so many different speeds here, are all of them going to leave at the same time? No, some are going to stay, some are going to leave. So you're going to notice some evaporation there, right? But the water level will slowly decrease. Obviously, it depends on how much energy you're adding to the system, because if you leave a glass of water out in the sun, well, each of those particles, now their average kinetic energy is increasing because the sun is adding to that. So they're going to slowly leave, okay? More quickly leave rather than without the sun. And this allows us to, because water takes some of that heat with it. Okay? So it takes some of that heat to actually get to the right temperature and leave. And so this allows us to cool our bodies by sweating. So you get a bunch of water anywhere that you're sweating, and that allows us to kind of pour some of that body heat into that water, okay? Because you're sweating in multiple places, right? And when that water leaves and goes into the gas state, it's going to take some of that heat with it. Okay, and a lot of plants do this too. A lot of organisms do this. Okay, but this is why we sweat. I'm trying to decide if I want to talk about insulation by ice. I think I'm going to wait on this one. Okay, now the final property of water that we care about for now is the fact that it is the universal solvent. Okay, so hopefully you remember from your reading over the summer that a solvent is the thing that is actually doing the dissolving. Okay, so if I had another glass of water, right? Lots of glasses of water going on here. I had a glass of water and I put like a little tablet of medicine in there, right? Like an Alka-Seltzer tablet or something like that. Okay, just put a little tablet of medicine, and it's going to dissolve. Okay, so in this case, the thing being dissolved is the tablet, and the thing doing the dissolving is the liquid that the tablet is found in. So the thing doing the actual dissolving is our solvent, and the thing being dissolved is our solute. Okay, you really need to get used to using this terminology because we're going to be talking about it a lot in the upcoming units. Okay, so a solution is any liquid that is homogeneous, which means that all of it is pretty much the same throughout. So right now, this little drawing I've done here is not homogeneous. I clearly have water and I have a tablet, but if I were to give it, an hour, depending on the size, right? If I were to wait an hour, eventually I would have pretty consistent water. Well, what seems like water, but it's really water with a bunch of that tablet inside of it. It's just so spread out you can't even see it anymore. Okay, so let me sorry, my button's not working here. All right, so your solute is what actually gets dissolved, and water is what we call the universal or a very versatile solvent. Okay, so water is so good at doing what it does. It's absolutely crazy how good water is at, well, I don't have an eraser on here. Oh well, it's absolutely crazy how good water is at its job. So what you can see going on in this picture is I have this weird green and yellow, it almost looks like a crystal, and that's because it is a crystal, okay? A molecular example of a crystal. Okay, and this is actually table salt. This is NaCl. Okay, so this is what you put on your food at the dinner table. Now, you'll notice that the Na, that's sodium, is really, really small, and it has a positive charge. And the Cl, the chlorine, is a lot bigger, and it has a negative charge. So each of those are ions. They're charged, so they're ions. And so they like to hang out together. So we would call that, we're bringing it back to chapter 2, we would call that an ionic bond. Okay? Now water is really, really good at breaking these bonds. Okay? These ionic bonds are pretty strong, but if you put put salt in water, you'll notice that pretty quickly it'll dissolve, especially if you kind of stir it around a little bit. Okay? And so what you're basically doing is you're breaking apart this weird structure. Right? You see how this structure is kind of just locked together? But over here we started to see some of them come apart. So these are water molecules, just like we saw before, and they're actually surrounding each of the ions. So they get into all these little grooves, and they surround the sodium ion, they surround the chlorine ions, and they just separate them. Okay, and if you look closely, you will notice that the chlorine ion, the Cl minus here, that's the big green guy, is actually surrounded by the white and smaller parts of the water molecule. So those are our hydrogens. Well, why would the hydrogens be touching the chlorines? Well, if you remember, our hydrogens are our positive part of the molecule, and this is our negative ion. So they are attracted to each other. Okay, there's a little bit of an attraction here. Okay, it's another set of hydrogen bonds. And the same thing is happening over here. Even though hydrogen isn't going to be involved here, so my sodium ion is going to be attracted to my oxygen because the oxygen is somewhat negative and the sodium ion is positive, and positive and negative are attracted. Now there's no hydrogen involved here, but we're still going to refer to this as a hydrogen bond. Okay? Now, when you're talking about solvents and solutes, just remember that like dissolves like. So one thing dissolves something that's like it. Okay? And that matters a lot when we talk about water, because water is what we call polar, right? Remember when we were talking about how it has that positive side and that negative side? Well, we refer to that as polarity. Okay, I'm going to put H plus and O minus, even though it's not a full ion. I just don't want to draw the sigma. Okay, so when you have different pluses and minuses on the same molecule, this is all one molecule, we call that being polar because there's two or more poles. There's a negative pole like on a magnet, and there's a positive pole like on a magnet. Okay, and so this means that it is polar, and polar things dissolve other polar things. Like dissolves like, polar dissolves polar. And when things are polar, we refer to them as hydrophilic. Okay, so hydro, of course, means water. Philic means love or to like. Okay, and hydrophobic would be you are afraid of water. Now, obviously, these molecules aren't afraid of anything, but they steer away from water, okay, and other polar molecules. So if you are hydrophilic, I just want to look at this left column for now. If you are hydrophilic, that means that you like water. You have an affinity for water. You are attracted to it, or you are willing to put up with it, if you will. Okay, these are going to be polar things. So anything that has a positive and a negative side, like water itself. But it's also going to be ions. Okay, so ions, remember, are things that have completely transferred their electrons, and so now they are charged. So like Na plus and Cl minus. They are charged, and they're going to be attracted to the water just like we saw before. Here are some examples of stuff we will see both in organisms and without, or outside of them, rather, that are hydrophilic. So cellulose, sugar, salt. Sugar dissolves in water, of course. Like if you make tea and you want to sweeten it up, you can put some sugar in it, and it's going to dissolve fairly easily because tea is mostly water. Okay, and your blood also has a bunch of stuff in it. In fact, it has sugars in it. Okay, so an example of an organism that, or a part of an organism that is hydrophilic would be blood, because blood has a lot of water, and also it can dissolve other solutes like sugar in it. Okay, so we're going to talk about blood sugar later. But hydrophobic is anything that hates water, and tries to stay away from it. You guys have probably seen oil and water interact. Oil will typically sit on top of the water unless it's denser. Okay, and fats, one of our major macromolecules that we're going to talk a lot about in the next 2 chapters. Those are very hydrophobic. They don't typically like to hang out with water, and that's going to be really, really, really important for us. So here's an example of a protein. So proteins, you will notice, are huge, right? So here's a water molecule, and the water molecule is a lot smaller than this protein. I just kind of want to give you an idea of scale, and typically these proteins are actually going to be shown as even bigger. But this protein is water soluble. So something being water soluble means that it can dissolve, it can be a solute in water. Okay, so water is represented all around, and I've shown little I haven't. Pearson has shown little particles here. Okay, and there's more, but in order to show you, we kind of had to get rid of some of them, right? Because there's trillions. It's absolutely insane how many there are. So you'll notice if you zoom in on an area that there are different charges, and this is the Greek letter for partial. Okay, so there are some partial charges on the protein, just like there are on the water molecules. And you'll notice that once again, plus likes minus and minus likes plus. Okay, so some proteins like water and some proteins don't like water. Now, we're going to talk very briefly about acids and bases. Okay, but for water, what I really want to talk about is, here I have 2 water molecules. Okay, they're just going to hang out with each other, right, through that hydrogen bond. And sometimes that is going to cause some changes in the chemical formula. Okay, so instead of just having 2 water molecules, sometimes that attraction is enough to pull that hydrogen ion over to hang out with the oxygen ion pretty permanently. Okay, so here we see that it looks like a water, but with this 3rd bump, right? And so that's actually a 3rd hydrogen ion, atom, and it's now called a hydronium ion, H3O+, so it's positive charged, and you know it's charged because it's called an ion. And we also, because we had 2 water molecules, one of them gained that hydrogen, so therefore the other one had to lose its hydrogen. And so the one that lost its hydrogen, well, if you lose a positive thing, you're now going to be negative. So now we have a hydroxide ion, an OH-. And these 2 things are things that I just want you to be a little bit familiar with, because we're going to be talking about ions, and specifically hydronium and hydroxide ions, in the context of acids and bases. Okay, so when you gain a proton, you're basically gaining an H+. Okay, so if you look at H2O, if I were to add an H+, it could become H3O, 3 because we went up from 2, and then a little plus sign. Okay, and then if you lose a proton, well, then you just take away an H+. So if I had H2O, I can just take away an H and then take away a plus sign. So now I have OH-. So now I have my hydroxide ions. Okay. Now, the reason this matters for right now is in the context of basic acids and bases. So acids have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so that's what's going on up here. Our acids have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. So a lot of acids, like strong acids, are going to look like HCl. Okay, now you know that Cl is very negative, and hydrogen we usually see as positive, right? And so that is actually going to dissociate pretty easily. So this hydrogen ion will just leave, and now we have more H+ inside of the solution. A base kind of does the exact opposite. Okay, it's going to have reduced hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so it's going to be attracted to, so if you look here, we have our hydroxide ion, okay, our OH-, and it's attracted to a sodium ion. Now, they were ions to start, but now they're so closely linked that they've formed an ionic bond, and so we can just list them together like this without the charges. Okay? Now, most biological fluids really like a pH of 6 to 8. Okay, so 6 is slightly acidic, 8 is slightly basic, and 7 is neutral. Okay, so left of 7, so between 0 and 7, that is acidic, and 7 to 14 is basic, but at 7 you are neutral. Okay, and we're going to talk more about what that actually means, but just to kind of give you an idea of what this pH scale looks like, here are some things that are across the entire gradient. Okay, so if you look at very, very acidic stuff, you start to see battery acid, gastric juice, lemon juice, vinegar, wine, cola. It's all things that you think of as being acidic, right? Tomato juice, it's got that very acidic flavor to it. Okay, now, hopefully you're not tasting urine, but it is slightly acidic as well. Okay, now as you get closer to 7, remember that is neutral. You have roughly an equal hydrogen ion concentration as you do a hydroxide ion concentration. Okay, and these are shown in these little diagrams here. Up here in the acidic, we have way more H pluses. Look how many H pluses for only 2 OH minuses. Here we have about the same on of each, and down here in the basic, we have the opposite. Okay, but as you go towards neutral, you start to see pure water. That's kind of our baseline neutral. Okay, and then we have human blood, tears. A lot of biological fluids, as we said, are going to be between 6 and 8. That's why we see like urine here on the slightly acidic side, and the inside of the small intestines, all of those yummy fluids are going to be just slightly basic. Okay? And if you keep going down, you'll start to see a lot of cleaners on the heavy basic side. So like soaps are basic, bleach is basic, oven cleaner is super basic, ammonia is basic, all of these things that clean. And that's really interesting, and it's awesome to talk about, and we will talk about it, but for now, I just kind of want you to notice that pattern. Okay. All right, so something that you need to just be familiar with and be able to do once or twice on the AP exam is calculating your pH. Okay, this is going to look really complicated, but these little brackets represent concentration, so remember like molarity from chemistry. Okay, so that's our concentration. And an H plus concentration is basically how many H plus particles there are per unit volume. Same with OH minus, it's in the brackets, so we're talking about concentration. Now when you multiply those concentrations, it needs to equal 10 to the negative 14. Okay, so if your hydrogen ion concentration is 10 to the negative 6 molar, then your hydroxide concentration is going to be 10 to the negative 8 concentration, yes. So when you multiply those, remember if you multiply two things that have exponents, you can add the exponents together, so you're adding negative 6 and negative 8. Basically, a consequence of this equation is that pH can be calculated with a negative log function. Okay, so this is a negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. And that sounds really complicated, but if I were to give you a hydrogen ion concentration, so H plus concentration is 10 to the negative 2, I could have you calculate the pH. Remember that 0 to 14 scale? You can calculate the pH really, really easily. Okay, so negative log of 10 to the negative 2, put that in your calculator, and you're going to get positive 2 because it's a negative of a negative. Okay, so your pH in this situation is 2. Then if I were to give you OH minus concentration as 10 to the negative 10th power, that means that your hydrogen ion concentration is 10 to the negative 4th. Okay, so we applied that first equation. And now that we have our hydrogen ion concentration, we can actually calculate our pH, and we're going to get 4. Okay, and you may notice that, hey, when the negative exponent is 4, for the hydrogen ions, my pH is 4. And when it's negative 2, my pH is 2. Okay, so you'll notice trends like that. Now, buffers are things that basically prevent your acidity or your basic part of your solution from changing too much. Sometimes you want things to stay the same because things are sensitive inside of there. So buffers will kind of help you keep things the same. Okay, so it helps keep your blood at about 7.4 pH. So remember, that would be slightly basic. Sometimes blood is slightly acidic if you have held your breath for too long. We'll talk about that later. Okay, if the blood drops down to 7 or goes up to 7.8, that is bad news bears. You're going to die. Okay, so it's a really thin range that we're safe in. We're safe at 7.1 roughly to 7.7. Okay. Now, as I said, when you hold your breath, sometimes that's going to affect the acidity of your blood, and that's because carbon dioxide will get into the blood. Remember, that's what you exhale. And so that's going to cause some acidity because it's going to go into the water of your blood and all that stuff. And we're going to talk about that, but I don't want to harp on it too much. So I don't want you to memorize this equation down here, this carbonic acid bicarbonate system. I do not want you to memorize it. I just want you to notice that we have an acid here, and that acid has lost a hydrogen ion. That's what acids do, right? And as a consequence, we now have HCO3 minus. That's our bicarbonate, okay? This happens in your blood. That's all you need to worry about right now, okay? And also, we talked about CO2 getting into water. That's what makes your sodas so bubbly, and also acidic. But it also happens to our ocean, especially now, because we've added a whole bunch of CO2. A whole bunch, okay? And then that CO2 slowly dissolves into the ocean. Yes, the gas dissolves into the ocean. And then that combines with the water, and it forms H2CO3. And then that H2CO3, that should look familiar. Okay, that's our carbonic acid over here, is then going to lose its hydrogen ion. And now we're going to have our bicarbonate right down here. Okay. And basically, now we have an acidic ocean. Okay, we have acid in our oceans. Okay, now that may not sound like a huge deal, or it might sound really scary. It should sound scary, okay, because that acid will now basically allow the ocean to dissolve the shells of a lot of organisms. So a lot of organisms make calcium carbonate shells. Okay, so that's what's going on right here. But if you start to mess with this chemistry, now the ocean is going to be able to take apart those shells. Okay, so a lot of organisms are having more trouble now actually producing or maintaining their shells, okay, made up of that calcium carbonate because of all that hydrogen ion in the ocean. Okay, and I believe that is everything. Yep, so that is everything that I wanted to cover. Here's a nice little slide that kind of shows examples of things about water at work in living organisms. And then here's just all of the properties of water that we care about. But for now, that's going to do it for water. And I'm going to talk about some macromolecules and other chemistry next.